All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Friday. For us here in history, of course, this is the last day of classes because next week we're going to go into presentations, and so that will take us uh, hopefully Tuesday and Wednesday. If we finish our presentations by maybe Wednesday or so, then I'll bring back some other material for us to look at in those last couple days. But for now, we'll kind of try to tie up loose ends as best that we can. Okay. So I kind of wanted to. Whoops. I'll just change this here. I kind of wanted to put it to you guys because for the last little while, well, for the last few months, we've looked at the history of the 20th century, right? And there's a lot to talk about, right? It's an eventful 100 years, right? We've got two world wars, we've got sort of the boom of the 1920s, and then the Great Depression of the 1930s. We've got a Second World War. We've got the rise of fascism in Germany and in Italy. We've got the creation of a brand new economic and political system in communism. We have revolutions. We have genocides. We have a Cold War that lasts 50 years or so. We have the emergence of another global superpower, right? We have China coming from, nothing to, again, global superpower status. We've talked about a few democratic leaders, but also a few fascist and authoritarian ones. We finished off here talking about two very prominent non-Western leaders, right? Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. And so there's been a lot to digest, right? This is a very full 100 years, and of course, we've barely scratched the surface, right? There's all kinds of things happening in Africa which we completely ignored, right? There's there's Japan, which of course we've not dealt with really in any way. South America, there's all kinds of things going on in South and Central America during this period that we didn't look at. So there's, we've just kind of scratched the surface of the broad outline of what's going on in this period. But even so, there's been a lot to talk about, and of course we could dig deeper and come up with more. But what can you do in 13 weeks, right? So what I wanted to do here just for a few minutes is to consider this, right? Is that this is some of the things that get said about history, right? Is that history teaches us that blah 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 blah, right? Something. Or, you know, the reason we study history is to not repeat the mistakes of the past, right? Or those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, right? We kind of hear these sayings over and over again. And so maybe the question we should ask ourselves here is, what can we actually learn from the 20th century, right? See you Tuesday, Ryan.
Yeah.
What can we actually learn from this period of history, right? Here we are in the 21st century. We're 21 years into it, so we've got 79 more to go. So what can we learn about the last 100 years that can help us in this upcoming 100 years? What are the lessons or ideas that we should pay attention to?
Yeah, I think the Chinese government, Chinese community, must learn something from the Swedish municipal politicians. Because when the Mao was the president of the China, he actually did almost the very similar things that he
Say that again. He almost did.
When Mao was the president of China, he actually did like very similar things to the giving like the land economy and let to farmers in the soil. But like when the Soviet Union is down, like, we know that this road is not okay, so we change it to the marketing economy.
Okay. So the past and the current Chinese government can learn from the Soviet example, right? And
Both
this,
of us are Canadian, and Tuesday mentions that one of the demonstrators is not working. So we
yeah.
choose another.
Yeah, and he's right, right? It didn't, it didn't work from the beginning, and it didn't really work all the way through, right? And it's people, the Soviet people suffered, the Russian people suffered because of it, right? And so, yeah, there's a lesson to be learned there that, if you want, if you want communism, then that's just not the way. It just doesn't work that way, right? Yeah, that's a good one. What else? What else can we learn? Hey, Andre. What else can we learn from this history of the 20th century that might be useful to us?
Canadian is misunderstood. We don't have such a strict Indian.
Sorry, say that one more time.
The Indian residential school, we don't have this in India. But in the everywhere in the world, we won't do genocide again.
Well, okay, well, hopefully not, right? We've got, we've, we didn't really deal with all of the genocides in the 20th century, right? But we definitely talked about the Holocaust. We've talked about Indian residential schools that kind of, pushed its way into our course here. And so we've got lots of examples of genocide, right? And so yeah, maybe we can learn from that and not have it happen again, right? We read that article with the 8 stages of genocide, right? So that article was saying that genocides are not accidents, right? And they're not unpredictable, right? You can see them coming if you pay attention to the signs, and you can try to interrupt them, right? So hopefully we can pay attention to, good morning. Hopefully we can pay attention to those signs if we see them again, right? What else? What other lessons can we learn from 20th century?
I think we can learn from the sort of dictators, Hitler and
Yeah?
yes, so in my experience that threat of Chinese government, so yeah, so that's good things to down what the dictators think.
That's true, right? We've had the 20th century does have its share of dictators, right? From Hitler to Mussolini to Francisco Franco, right, in Spain, to we can probably call Mao a dictator. We've got Kim Il Sung and Kim Jong Un in North Korea, right? I don't know if we can call Vladimir Putin a dictator or not. We'll leave it up to you. It's complicated with him, right? But yeah, we have lots of examples of dictators, and we kind of know how they work, right? We've seen them rise to power, sometimes through violence or state overthrows. We've seen them, purge their opponents and make sure that they're the sole power, right? And sometimes they've been difficult to remove, right? Hitler committed suicide. Mussolini was captured and executed. Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania was, when he didn't step down, he was captured and put in front of a firing squad, right? So these guys, once they gain power, they don't give it up very easily, right? And sometimes it seems to take extreme situations to get them out. But we should know, we know how they work, right? We know the kind of things that they say. We know that they, position themselves as the hero, right? The person who's going to save the country from some kind of threat, right? That only they can save the country, right? We see their use of propaganda, use of violence against citizens, right? What else can we learn from 20th century? Well, yeah, well, that's kind of where we're going with this, right? Is where, what can we learn so that it doesn't happen again, right? What can we avoid? Maybe the lesson of appeasement, right? We saw when Hitler was being aggressive in Europe, right? And he was taking control of the Rhineland and then of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. He was being kind of very aggressive and very pushy, and other world leaders just kind of let him get away with it, right? They just thought, oh, well, we'll just give him this and then he'll quiet down, right? Oh, well, we'll just give him this and then he'll be quiet, right? Then he'll be satisfied. But of course, as we all very well know, that wasn't the case, right? And maybe history would have been very different if people stood up to that aggression from the beginning. And instead, they kind of let it go and eventually had to fight a very costly and destructive war because of it, right? And so, I don't know, maybe there's something to be said there, that if we oppose the actions of another country, then we should stand up to it, right? And not sort of, not let it go. What else? What else can we learn? Maybe I'll put this back up. Maybe that'll help us.
They spend too much money on the military to do the whole thing. So we know that we want our country to develop as well. But also we need to make sure that our people in this country will get up enough food and something. It's not just the military that actually do.
Yeah, we definitely saw that in Soviet Union, where they sort of got carried away with military spending, right? And the people who suffered were the regular people, right? They didn't often have enough food. Sometimes they didn't have the type of they didn't have the type of lifestyle that maybe their counterparts in America did, right? And they were paying for this gigantic weapon buildup and military that they really couldn't afford, right? And I guess it's a question of what good does all that weaponry really do, right? Because the United States and the Soviet Union built up their massive military, but neither of them really used any of it, right? It was all just a threat. It was all just a deterrent, right? And I don't know, maybe we see the same thing happening in North Korea today, where massive amounts of their money goes into developing nuclear weapons while their people are, living a very basic lifestyle, a very limited lifestyle under Kim Jong-un. And maybe you could accuse the US of the same thing, right? Lots of people in the US are living in poverty and struggling to, put food on the table and clothe themselves and their children. And yet the US military budget is, gosh, what is it, 500 billion a year or something? Insane, right? Huge amounts of money are spent on the military, but is that a good use of people's money, right? What else? What else can we learn?
In the early world, when the Yeltsin just become the president, America just become the from Soviet Union, he started the new economic policy too quick. So the economic development is just being destroyed by make a big change too fast.
Hmm. Yeah, we can definitely, although I don't I don't know, good morning. I don't know that we would see a situation like that in the future, but yeah, we saw Boris Yeltsin try to make massive economic changes very, very quickly, right? And again, that's not that's not good for an economy, right? Economies don't like big shocks, right? Because they're difficult to manage, right? And people even, how long have people been studying economies? A couple hundred years, a few hundred years now. If you go back, it's probably Adam Smith with The Wealth of Nations, where he starts to sort of study and analyze sort of modern economies, and we still don't entirely know how to control them, right? They're complicated things. Sometimes you try to change one thing and then something unexpected happens somewhere else. Economies are really difficult to manage, right? And they definitely don't respond well to huge changes that happen in a short period, right? And so Boris Yeltsin kind of optimistically or foolishly or whatever you want to say, he makes those changes really quickly, and yeah, it's pretty destructive, right? Certainly, Russia kind of came out of it, and they're in a better place than they were in the 1990s, but it's still pretty difficult for a lot of people, right? What else? It's interesting in some ways how, the history of this period has been almost a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, right? We've often found that, that those two sides have been fighting each other, right? We saw it in World War II, right, with the Nazis versus the Allies. We saw it during the Cold War, and I don't know, maybe we're seeing it, some remnant of that still today, right? Where we have generally Western countries are allied against, sometimes against China, sometimes against Russia. But I think there's still that opposition between democratic nations and authoritarian ones. Do you think one will eventually triumph? Do you think authoritarianism will beat democracy, or democracy will beat authoritarianism? Or will it always be a struggle?
Like, how long are you talking about?
How long? I don't know, as long as it takes. No, maybe it's worth thinking about though, right? We always seem to see a conflict between countries that have those two basic types of government, right? And the good morning. And the Cold War can even be thought of something like that too, right? Is that we were, it's kind of capitalism versus communism, but really was it really about that, or was it about authoritarianism versus democracy? Right? The power of the people versus the power of the party or the single leader, right? And again, will we see one of those systems eventually triumph? I don't know. No? They're what? It's interesting. Yeah, like, we have, it's like for every, like, when we saw at the end of the Cold War where, as soon as the Soviets kind of backed off and said, okay, we're not going to intervene in Eastern Europe anymore, the people were very quick to throw off their authoritarian leaders and create a democracy, right? But for every kind of event there, you have, another person trying to consolidate power and sort of make themselves into a single leader, right? So there's always this kind of back and forth flow, right, between people who are trying to take sole power and the people who are trying to, get rid of that power or throw it off, right? But maybe that's a struggle, right, between, just how we want our countries to be, right? What are the benefits of having an authoritarian government if you're just a regular person?
Every decision can be made up so quick, like because we didn't have to discuss about it.
Yeah.
We just like, if you think, oh, that's right, that's the right thing to do, just do it. No one will like have the opposite opinion of it.
Yeah, things tend to happen very quickly, right? Because authoritarians don't need to discuss or debate or vote, right? The leader makes the decision and that is it, right? And you are off.
Yeah,
Dem-
you can make some long-term decisions. For example, if you want to do the bridge, if in the 20 years, if you choose a democracy, maybe you can just be president for 8 years. So like, what's the meaning of that you do this bridge? So
Yeah, it's so long-term planning can be easier as well, right? Democracies unfortunately have very short-lived governments, right? Here in Canada, we must have an election every 4 years, right? It says it. I think it's in the Constitution, I believe. Is it Constitution maybe, but it says it in the Elections Act. An election must be held every 4 years. So, even in the best case, we might have a brand new government every 4 years, right? And it's hard to make long-term planning when one government comes in and makes a bunch of plans, and then the next government comes in and says, oh, those guys were a bunch of idiots. We're going to do this, right? And so every 4 years, you've got people making new plans, right? Whereas if you have a long-term authoritarian party, they can continue to see those plans through, right? Certainly the Soviet Union did, right? The plan was full communism, and they stuck to that goal for decades, right? Turns out it was a bad idea, but they stuck with it. Whereas democracies are always in danger of changing course, right? New governments will, overrule the stuff that the last one did. Yeah. What else? Any other benefits to living in a authoritarian state? What are the benefits to living in a democratic state?
Political opinion is a kind of good thing for everything.
It's a good thing for.
For like I would say like everything because like people can just discuss about it. But sure, like there's some downside about it because it would take times for you to like discuss the whole thing or like debate or like vote to vote.
Yeah.
But eventually, like people in there will, I would say like, because there's so many new ideas brought up together. So like maybe if something is going wrong, maybe the people would realize it and bring it back to the right track.
Yeah. It's true, right? Democracies generally have freedom of speech, right? And people can argue about problems and offer perspectives and, try to create a good solution, right? And again, the downside of that is that it takes a lot of time and sometimes it's frustrating and people are arguing about things for a long time and you want to tear your hair out and say, just make a decision already. But, the benefit of that is at least everyone gets to participate, right? Everyone gets to talk about it. Everyone gets to have a say, right? They get to voice their opinion. Even if what ultimately happens isn't what they agree with, they can at least say what they want to say, right? What about other things? Other benefits to living in a democratic society?
Yeah,
What? I cannot hear you. Oh, the Mark's point? Mark's point was that people can have a say, right?
Yeah.
Right, Mark? People are able to voice their opinion. And yeah, you can at least discuss and express what you think. More perspectives can come to light, and sometimes that's better, right? To solve a problem is to look at it from different angles. Another thing I guess we could say is that, authoritarian governments tend to put the state first, right? Democracies tend to put the individual first, right? And again, it depends when you want to put, it depends on your priorities, right? And sometimes it's best to put the needs of the state before the individual, right? If you're about to be attacked by someone and go to war, then yeah, you should put the good of the state before the individual to, when you go to war. But in non-war time, maybe people prefer their own rights to come first, right?
This is like democracy helps people's equality. Because like in America now, like the activism, they want things like the black people or like the black people to live for them. So like their policy have a lot of things said and like they will give the benefits to black people.
Are you saying that? So we have sort of racial inequality in the United States,
Yeah.
but are you saying that?
So like United States is a country that is democracy. Everyone is like the most free country. So I think that the Latiners they write down a lot of things to do some a lot of to do a lot of policies to make sure that like the black people will get some benefits because they want them to vote for them.
That's true, right? So I guess, well, I guess, being in a democracy doesn't necessarily mean that everyone will be looked after appropriately, right? I mean, Canada's been a democracy for 154 years now, and we didn't treat Indigenous people very well at all, right, in the past. Nor did we treat Asian immigrants or South Asian immigrants. We didn't treat them very well either. But maybe there's more chance that they will be looked after and taken care of in a democracy, maybe, because they can voice their opinion, because they can stand up and and sort of identify what's an inequality or an injustice. Maybe it's tough to know, right? Because again, democracies are, there's authoritarian governments that have discriminated against people and perpetrated genocides, but there's also democracies that have done the same thing. So maybe.
Most of the time, something bad does happen, so that the government can understand that government,
Yeah, and it's true, right? People have often had to resort to pretty dramatic means, right? They've had to protest and sometimes riot and sometimes have a full-on revolution, right? To get what they've wanted, right? And so, and I guess that's the struggle between the two sides, right? And that, an authoritarian is much more likely to put down the revolution, right? And we saw lots of Soviet leaders do that. We saw Chinese leaders do that in 1989 at Tiananmen Square, right? There was too much rioting, too much protesting. The government puts down the revolt, right? But then, democracies are prone to do that too, but maybe to a lesser degree. I don't know, right? Usually, I guess the benefit of a democracy, I guess, is that when people want to voice their displeasure with the government is much less likely to sort of respond with force. Not always, but I think maybe sometimes, right? Because if you don't have the support of the people in a democracy, you basically just have to step down, right? But authoritarians, as we know, don't like to do that. They prefer to hold on to power at any cost, right? And so they will squish the people when needed, right? What else? Any other big trends? Certainly, we've seen tons of technological change, right? We come into this century with people like riding horses and, going on steamships if they've got lots of money. And we come out of this, we come out of this century, with people who have already been on the moon, with people who are flying all over the globe, and satellites are in space, and internet and mobile phones and all kinds of stuff, right? There's a huge technological jump from 1900 to 2000. And I don't know if anyone can imagine. I cannot imagine what the difference between 2000 and 2100 is going to be, right? I assume technology will continue to change as fast or just as or faster. Who knows, right? Do you think anyone standing in the street in 1905 would have predicted that you'll have this little glowing tablet in your hand and you'll be able to press on it, and when you press on it, you can do anything. You can find any piece of information. You can talk to anyone you want. You can see them with FaceTime, although they wouldn't know what FaceTime is. You can book yourself a travel ticket and you can fly to anywhere in the world. Unbelievable, right? And the fact that you can just click it and it recognizes your face, right? Nobody would have been able to predict in 1905 that something like this would have existed, right? Even stuff that looks like this doesn't even show up in science fiction until like the 1950s, right? Have you ever seen the original Star Trek, the old Star Trek? Oh man, they had these things so they could, from the spaceship they would sort of beam down, they would sort of transport down to the planet to sort of explore, and they'd have these communicators, right? And they would have the communicator and they'd pull it out of their pocket and they'd flip it open like a flip phone. They'd flip it open and then they could talk to the ship, right? And say, okay, beam us back up, or send more people down, we're in trouble, or something like that. But even that kind of technology, that technology didn't even exist, but people didn't even start dreaming about it until the 50s or the 60s. In 1905, nobody could have thought of this. So again, I wonder, in 2021, the technology that people will have in 2100, we may not even be able to imagine it right now, because I guarantee you in 1905 nobody imagined this kind of thing. Like, this is wild, right? Wild technology. And here it is, we all have one, right? Everybody has one, almost. Anything else from the 20th century? Let me ask you this. We saw, after World War I, they created the League of Nations, right? Because they said, wow, things really got out of hand in World War I. We had this big, continent-wide conflict. We need some sort of greater power that can help keep countries from going to war, right? So they created the League of Nations. We didn't really deal with it very much, but it was a reasonable failure, I would say, more or less. Later on, we created the United Nations, which of course is still around. Its effectiveness is so-so, right? Really good in terms of charity and humanitarian stuff, but in terms of kind of geopolitics, doesn't really have a lot of teeth, right? Do you see any greater kind of body like the UN forming, or maybe the UN getting more powers? We seem to be dealing with things that are increasingly global threats, right? Coronavirus wasn't, it wasn't an American problem or a Chinese problem, it was everybody's problem, right? Global warming and climate change, that's not just our problem, that's everybody's problem, right? Those are global problems and they require global solutions. But of course we have no global body, right? Every country has its own government and every country is kind of in it for themselves, right? And so do you think we'll ever have some sort of like Earth government? Like instead of the European Union, we'll have the Earth Union.
Not until we found some aliens.
Not until we find some aliens?
Yeah.
You know. I read an interesting article about that last week, and there's been people who have been broadcasting messages into space, right? Just in case there's any aliens out there that we'd be able to contact them, right? But one person pointed out, and it sounded a little like science fiction, but when you think about it, it's not. Who gave those guys permission to do that? Who gave those guys permission to transmit something out into the vastness of space saying, hey, here we are? Yeah, but the government of the United States or whatever, right? But think about this. Now, if there's life out there, right? If there's alien life out there, and if that alien life is technologically developed enough to receive our signal, right? And let's say they can actually come to us, does that mean they're going to be more technologically advanced than us or less?
More.
Way more, right? If they can actually come to us, then they've got technology that we've never even heard of before. Now, from our own global history, think about colonization, right? Where we saw Europeans going to other countries, and Europeans had much more developed technology than lots of the people they encountered, right? They had guns and ships and cannons and all kinds of things, and dynamite. And so how did that work out for the people who were colonized? Not good, right? Didn't go very well for them. And so again, if we're, waving a flag saying, hey, here we are on Earth, and, another, form of life comes to visit us, that might not go very well for us because we are not very technologically advanced, right? Especially when you're talking about space, right? Here on Earth, we're getting a pretty good feel for technology, right? We're able to manipulate people's DNA and do all kinds of things and send Jeff Bezos into space and unfortunately bring him back. Sorry, I shouldn't really throw shade at Jeff Bezos. I don't really care about him that much. But here on Earth, we're very technologically advanced, right? But when you put us into the context of the universe, not so much, right? And so, again, is it a good idea for us to transmit to the galaxy, hey, here we are? Do we want anyone to come visiting us? If they do, are they going to leave us alone? Or are they going to take over our planet, right? And again, it's a little bit science fiction and a little bit ridiculous, but it's worth thinking about, right? Nobody gave these guys permission to do this, really. And what if somebody does come, right? What if something is out there and it does come here, right? We don't understand space, right? We don't know what's out there. And so again, I don't mean to fearmonger people, but that's worth thinking about too, right? But anyway, that's another global issue, right? If there's an alien anything, then we're all in it together, right? And having the United States and China and Russia and the European Union argue over it is not going to do anyone any good, right? We need somebody who's looking after the entire planet, right? So I don't know. I don't see any sort of global government developing, but maybe we'll need one eventually, right? We're all living on the same planet, right? I don't know. Sorry, that was a little bit of a tangent on the space thing, but it was an interesting thought. And when the next sort of pandemic shows up, I think we need a global response, right? And we kind of got it together, sort of, on the fly, but we could do better. Might have to do better if the next virus is worse than coronavirus, right? We might have to be really organized. Anything else? Technology and nationalism and Cold Wars and sort of multi-country organizations that fail or sort of succeed or might be useful in the future. Got world wars, dictators, economic systems, revolutions, genocides, nuclear weapons. Well, maybe that's a pretty good review. You know, one of the things that, well, I thought I'd throw this in because I think it's humorous. You can't fool all the people all the time, but you can fool enough of them to rule a large country. I think that applies to Donald Trump. But again, that's just my opinion. You don't have to go along with that. But maybe one of the things worth learning kind of at the end of this is that, you know, one thing that we should learn from history is that often we don't learn from history, right? Often we don't look at the past and see the same things happening in the present, right? And I don't know why that is, right? Maybe, why do you think that is? Why do you think we have all this history, but then we often don't learn from it? We just make the same mistakes over again. Sure, right? When you're in the moment or decisions need to happen really quickly, sometimes people mess it up. Yeah?
Maybe we won't mess it up.
Maybe what?
You think we won't mess it up?
Why not?
Because, I don't know, maybe he's so confident.
Yeah. Well, maybe, tell me if you think this is true, but do you think maybe we look at people in the past and we think, oh, well, you know, we're so much smarter, right? We're so much more technologically advanced. Those people in the 50s, what a bunch of bozos, right? They didn't know what they were doing, right? And do you think it's tempting though to look at people in the past and think that somehow they were different than us? Yeah, probably, right? But people have been people for a long, long time, right? And so, you know, yes, we're living in different times and different cultures and, you know, under different sets of circumstances with different levels of technology, but human beings have kind of been the same for, you know, a couple 100,000 years now at least, right? And the people, you know, living 200,000 years ago are just the same as you are today, right? We're just living in a much more technologically advanced world, right? And so, but I think it's easy to look back at the past and say, oh, those people were uneducated, or they didn't realize, or they didn't know, or we know so much better. And I think it's very tempting to do that. But, you know, they're the same as you and I, right? I don't know. It is frustrating though sometimes to see like things happening in modern events, and you're like, oh, this has happened before, you know, like we've done this before and we're doing it again, right? And yeah, I don't know why we don't learn. Okay. Any last thoughts about History 12, the history of the 20th century? History in general, humans, politics, economies, wars.
Who do you think is the greatest leader in the 20th century?
Greatest leader in the 20th century. I don't know. I mean, you know, gonna say
Doesn't
Hitler.
matter.
I'm not gonna say Hitler. You know, you know, if you do some good things, but then a bunch of really bad things, like it kind of cancels out the good things, right? Like you can't say, oh, I, you know, turned my country into an industrial power. Oh yeah, but I also murdered a bunch of people. But focus on this, right? You can't pick and choose. I might say Martin Luther King, although he's not really. Well, he was, you know, he wasn't an elected government official, but he was a leader. It'd be tempting to say Gandhi, but there are some parts of his story that are kind of Nelson Mandela might be worth. We didn't deal with him at all, but I would suggest Nelson Mandela. Yeah, I don't know. There's probably quite a few of them, but I probably wouldn't pick any of the ones that we've spoken about in this class. You know, that's the thing, is that in terms of, you know, greatest leaders of the 20th century, I'm not sure. You know, the guys we talked about certainly had a big impact, but I don't know that I would put them at the top of my list. But
Do you think the Stalin and the Hitler they are very similar? Stalin and Hitler.
what do I think about them?
Do you think they are similar?
Do I think they're similar?
Yeah.
Sure. I think there's some comparisons to be drawn for sure, right? They're both ruthless. They're both, you know, fully, you know, in full control of their countries. Both had no regard for the lives of others, right? Although, you know, Hitler had, you know, had a certain fondness for the pure German people. But again, if you opposed him or criticized what was going on in the state, that would make you an enemy of the state and you would be crushed, right? So his kind of love for the German people only went so far as they agreed with what he was doing. And as soon as they didn't, squish, right? So yeah, I mean, both of them embark on a, you know, on a program of kind of revitalizing their countries, right? And both succeed. Yet both are kind of very brutal in their, you know, in how they deal with people. Both of them perpetrate a genocide. Yeah, I think there's some similarities between the two, for sure. Both have mustaches. Anything else that you want to say or ask?
Like, so one last thing, like, you know, in like some of World War II, that kind of period, and during the Cold War, like, America had done a lot of propaganda.
Who did a lot?
Propaganda.
Yeah.
So do you think that's kind of brainwashing to the people or something?
Propaganda?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, define brainwashing for me.
I don't know, like, maybe people are thinking like against what you want to do.
Okay. Well, that's the goal of propaganda, right? Is to get people to think about something or feel about something the way the government wants them to, right? And sometimes there's positive propaganda. I don't think I showed you any in this course, but if you look at like World War I or World War II recruitment posters, you know, trying to get people to sign up, you'll see some propaganda there, right? You'll see, you know, brave soldiers, you know, fighting a proud war. You'll see the enemy sort of portrayed in a monstrous fashion, right? You'll see some propaganda because the government wants people to, you know, root for their country and feel patriotic. They want them to demonize the people they're fighting against, and they want these young men to feel like so proud and so kind of devoted to their country that they will volunteer and go to war, right? And so you'll see some propaganda there. But yeah, there's lots of it, right? Some of it's subtle, some of it is, some of it is very obvious propaganda. But shoot, what was I reading? Oh, it was a guy who had defected from the Soviet Union I think in the 1970s or so. He escaped the Soviet Union and came to the West. And he was talking about the whole kind of Soviet system, right? And the way that, the way that the secret police worked and the way that the country worked. And he said, eventually there's so much propaganda and there's so much pressure to feel a certain way about things and believe certain things that people just believe it because it's easier, right? It's hard to, when everything in your society is telling you, this thing and this is the way that it is and this is good and this is bad, if you fight against it all the time, it's exhausting, right? Not to mention dangerous, right? If the KGB picks you up. But eventually people are just like, fine, like that's the way it is, because it's just too much mental and emotional work to push against it all the time. And people just start to go along with it because you just want to get on with your life, right? You don't want to be thinking about it all the time, right? And so he said he had escaped the Soviet Union, but he said, eventually you just kind of go along with it because it's the only way, right? Either you're getting picked up by the KGB because you're, an enemy of the state and a revolutionary or a counter-revolutionary, or you just kind of go along with it because, you read the paper, you read the propaganda, it's BS, but it's like, okay, I guess that's what it is, right? And you move on because you just can't, it's just too much work, right? And that's, propaganda is, in part trying to mislead and brainwash, but it also wears you down, right? And eventually people just go along with it because it's just easier, right? And propaganda is relentless, right? It's everywhere. Yeah. But governments, lots of governments use a little bit of propaganda. Here in the West, the propaganda is kind of more light, but it's, sometimes it's mostly patriotic and, meant to convince you that, Canada's this great place and, oh, Canada and all that stuff, which is, that's not false, but yeah.
Like Sushi, Germany, made an agreement to say that they both are from
Sorry, Germany and
Germany and Switzerland, they made a peace treaty that they want a partnership.
yeah.
So like, do you think Hitler will win this agreement as being listed?
Oh, if he didn't attack Soviet Union? Maybe. Yeah, so the Nazis and the Soviets had a non-aggression pact, right? Hitler violated it by attacking Soviet Union and sort of drove Joseph Stalin into the arms of the Allies, right? But yeah, I don't know. I think that Stalin probably would have been happy to just sit on the sidelines and let those two destroy each other, to be honest. And so I think if Hitler had not attacked him, maybe Stalin would have stayed out of World War II. I mean, if you assume the Japanese still bomb Pearl Harbor and it still brings the US into the war, I think they could probably still win. The Allies could still win, but I don't know. It depends if Stalin stays out of it, right? If he stays out, then maybe. If he joins Hitler and fights with him, who knows? Not a good move, though, to attack Soviet Union. Bad move. Anything else? Okie dokie. Well, I think I'll probably leave it there. I don't think I have any more history for you at the moment. Again, if we finish presentations on Wednesday or on Thursday, I'll have something else for you on Thursday or Friday. As I say, there's a lot of history we didn't deal with, and so we can always look at one more potentially interesting thing or whatever. But until then, again, make sure you're ready for Tuesday morning. Again, I'm going to pull random names out of a hat, and you got to be ready to go. Get me your slideshow by Sunday night, even if it's late Sunday night. I think the best way to do it is probably to attach it to a Teams message, because the Teams message doesn't seem to have any size restrictions. If you try to email it to me, sometimes they bounce back because they're too big. So get that to me, because then I can, we'll have a Zoom call going on, and I can put your presentation up on the screen so everyone can see it, okay? Other than that, I think that's all I have for you. Okay, so that is it. Have a good long weekend. No school on Monday. And I'll see you Tuesday, okay? Okay.